The coronavirus was a disaster for Britain, but not because of the virus. It was because of the way we responded to it. We've complained on this channel on multiple occasions about the way that this is no longer a government of decent, democratic and reasonable people. It's a government now of experts, or rather a government of extremists who will push you in a direction politically which is not in the best interests of the country, but instead serves their political hobby horses. We had in Britain effectively a coup d'etat during Boris Johnson's government, and Boris Johnson was giving evidence at the coronavirus hearings today. The reality was that he has basically admitted that shutting down schools was an extremely damaging thing. We now know that it's not just a failed vaccine rollout programme, but also the credibility of vaccines in general has been destroyed. Our civil discourse has worsened, our economics have been damaged, and the employability of young people has been absolutely trashed. All to stop you getting a bit of a cough. It was madness, and I hold Whitty, Valence and Van Tam to blame for it. And in this video, I'm going to go through the case against them and the reason why I personally would have jailed all three of them during that coup d'etat. Hello everyone, this is Andre Walker. Thanks so much for watching this video. Please do subscribe, but more importantly, please support the Patriot Fund. We are supporting patriotic causes up and down the country with small grants, and you can help. Just click the link below if you can. Okay, so let's take a step back and think what you or I would have done had we been the British Prime Minister at the time of the coronavirus outbreak. Well, the first thing you would have struggled with was the fact that they could see that in Wuhan there was some sort of major incident taking place. They could see that temporary buildings, i.e. hospitals, were being built. They knew that there was restrictions on people's movements, and they also knew that Communist China was desperately trying to cover up a major problem. Enter Dr. Tedros, that fake doctor, and the reason I say he's a fake doctor, he's the first head of the World Health Organization to not be a medical doctor. He's actually an Ethiopian communist who was put into the position in order to shine up the reputation of Xi Jinping of China, which of course he did. So in China, all of these lockdowns are taking place, and then Dr. Tedros says, nothing to see here, don't worry, this can't be spread from human to human. Now, at that point, as British Prime Minister, I would have called my officials in and asked if the United Kingdom was under attack and if we were at war. And the reason I would have asked that question is very simply this. There was clearly now a biological agent which had been released somehow. And we didn't know what was going on, but we did know it was highly likely that Tedros and Xi Jinping were lying, and they are long-term collaborators. And given that a biological agent has now been released in China, and the head of the World Health Organization deliberately placed there by China is trying to deny it happening, is suggestion, admittedly circumstantial, that potentially the country was under attack. Now, what happened instead was that people like Whitty and Fauci in the United States of America insisted that the issue wasn't major, and that in fact the coronavirus had come from an infected bat from the Wuhan fish market. The claim would have been ludicrous had it not been for the fact that it was also demonstrably untrue. And actually beyond that, it was something that they weren't willing to investigate. What they said, certainly Fauci said, was that you must not discuss the possibility that it came from a lab. In the United Kingdom, Whitty was sat in a meeting with the head of MI6, I think it was, who said that he believed it was a biological weapon, or at least that should be investigated. And Whitty said we must not investigate that. What, of course, Whitty and Fauci didn't tell the world was that the United States of America, through USAID, was funding the research in Wuhan. Now, I would personally give Fauci the death penalty for that. And I'll tell you why. Because if you look at it, he sits down with President Joe Biden, who admittedly wasn't very good, but he sat down with him. Or was it President Trump at the time? Either way, he sits down with the President of the United States of America. I don't know when the meeting was exactly. And he says, it couldn't possibly have come from the Wuhan lab. He didn't mention, I fund the Wuhan lab. I've commissioned the research. The American taxpayer is paying. Now, would you go to a meeting like that? Imagine as an example, I'm just going to make up an example right now. There was a car accident outside and you were asked to investigate what had happened and you didn't mention that it was your car that was involved. Imagine doing that. And then you later go, I didn't think it was relevant. Ugh, what a load of absolute garbage. So the reality is, the cover-up was not just in China, but also in the United Kingdom and the United States of America. So I would have been concerned about that. But actually what happened was that Whitty, Valance and Van Tam got their way, which was what we would do is we would throw away our emergency plan and instead we would follow communist China. The reason that was happening was very, very clearly this. Nobody at that point wanted to do anything different from Xi Jinping. So there was pressure from around the world, from the scientific community, to ensure that Xi didn't look bad and that instead we followed him rather than going with our own emergency plan. Of course, famously, our emergency plan in Britain was used by Sweden, but we didn't. But then on to Boris Johnson today. Now, let's be clear. The first lockdown might have been necessary for the Nightingale Hospital construction. I think there was real concern when the health service in northern Italy fell over and there was the bodies piling up. And people say, well, those Nightingale hospitals, they didn't even have any equipment in. They weren't going to need the equipment. They were basically the places that people were going to go to die in isolation, those people who were not going to be given respirators. But we put that lockdown. But I don't know whether the lockdown was a good idea, but I see the argument for that one. Also, I do want to say, just a side issue, that it is pretty rich listening to people like Starmer, listening to people like Hermer, listening to people like Shana Mahmood and all these people going on about the Human Rights Act when the reality is you and I were placed under house arrest during coronavirus and threatened with mandatory medical treatment. We were cut away from our family and we were banned from our jobs and we were locked up, effectively, admittedly in our own homes. Don't tell me about the Human Rights Act protecting my human rights, because the minute I needed some human rights, that thing was nowhere to be seen. But anyway, quite apart from that, so that lockdown. But then, of course, what happens is they start shutting the schools. Now, do you know that the average working class child in Britain is going to earn £100,000 less than what they would have done across their entire career because of that coronavirus lockdown? Think about this. The worst punishment you can give to a 14-year-old is to say that he or she is grounded for the weekend. It's the worst thing ever because it's a whole 2 days of not being able to see your mates and not being able to socialise and whatever. And that is just a function of the way a teenager is. They were locked up for, 18 months on and off. It was clearly torture. By the way, the prohibition of torture and cruel and unusual punishment in the Human Rights Act, that was ignored for teenagers as well, wasn't it? And so now there has been an explosion of mental health problems. You talk about the way that young people are a bit feral and, are shrill and over the top and perhaps lack the social intelligence to recognise the stupidity of their new green religion. But actually, it's you that caused the mental health crisis, British government. How can you blame them? They were the victims. And so Whitty, I say, has blood on his hands over that. The young people that are going to be successful will earn a lot less, but others who, the suicide rate has gone up and all kinds, hasn't it? And also I think for working class children, it was really bad. Just at the end of the street, there's a computer shop. And I remember at the beginning of the lockdown, I brought in my laptop to be repaired. And there was a woman who brought in a stack of 5 laptops. Now, obviously, they were varying ages. She said, these are my husband's old laptops. The kids are now off school. Can you fix them for me? They said, yes, no problem. It'll take about a week. Well, that's fine. But how many of you and how many ordinary families have 5 old laptops knocking around? They don't. I saw examples on BBC London of kids who were having to share 3 kids to a smartphone to attempt to do their work from school. That is just a complete and total nightmare. So we have that Whitty did. But here's the next thing that I think has done significant harm to children and young people. Imagine tomorrow, there was a launch of a cancer vaccine. And the chief medical officer of the United Kingdom stood up and said, right, this vaccine is 100% safe and it is 100% effective. And imagine that was true. Imagine it was actually true. The take-up rate would be comparatively low. The reason is because of the lies about the vaccine. I don't know whether the coronavirus vaccine was a good or bad idea, but I do know this. If you say it is 100% safe 100% of the time, and it is not 100% safe 100% of the time, and you get caught saying that lie, you destroy the credibility of every vaccine program. Nobody's going to have stuff injected into their bloodstream on the advice of people they know to be liars. It was ludicrous. What was it that the anti-vax people were saying? Well, what they were saying was, first of all, no medical procedure is 100% safe 100% of the time. Fine, okay. Next, the vaccine's been rushed through. No, it wasn't. We did all the checks, we just did them fast. That means rushing, right? That's literally the definition of rushing things through. I mean, you don't say, if you were to rush to work, it means you travel faster. It doesn't mean you only go halfway, right? So literally, that's what they're talking about. So then the anti-vaxxers said, well, you've indemnified the drug companies. Well, you think about it. Why have they indemnified the drug companies? Just in case the vaccine was dangerous. Well, why would the drug companies ask for that? Well, fairly obviously, because they'd rushed through the approval. People aren't stupid. You can literally say there is a risk associated with the vaccine and allow people to balance the decision. I didn't personally take the vaccine. I'll tell you why I didn't. Because you'd locked me up on my own anyway, right? So I knew that I wasn't going to die from coronavirus. I knew I wasn't in an affected group. And so then when I was forced to live on my own, I thought to myself, well, what's the bigger risk here? Sitting on my own or going to Slough to get the injection? So I decided not to go. Plus I resented the fact that I'd have to get a taxi, which would have cost 20 quid round journey to take this bloody thing. I think it was AstraZeneca who said that they would never do another pandemic vaccine ever again because their entire reputation has been destroyed. And I'll make this point to you. You know, if 40 million people get a vaccine and 1,000 people die as a result of the vaccine, it may well be that that was a good thing to do. But of course, when you start denying that anybody was injured or killed by it, that's when you completely destroy the credibility of the vaccine programme. And the reason why I relate that to kids is this, because vaccines have done a phenomenal amount for children and young people, and the vast majority of vaccines have been very successful. There was that issue with MMR, but it was later shown that actually what had happened was that kids were showing signs of autism at the same time as they get the injection. You've got to remember, one of the things that causes confusion with vaccines is if you vaccinate everybody, there is a percentage of people who will die the next day, but would have done anyway. So there was always going to be people who they'd turn around and say, Mickey was fine, he had that injection, next day we're dead. And similarly, there were lots of kids who got the MMR vaccine and then started showing signs of autism, and apparently it was just a coincidence. But, so it is a constant battle to maintain the credibility of vaccines, and Whitty, Valence and Van Tam had destroyed it. Destroyed it. Will we ever get that back? Question mark. No idea. And they made it worse by when it was clear they were lying about the safety of the vaccine. What they then did was they started demanding that it become mandatory. Now, I don't want to be shrill, but let's just be clear that the European Convention on Human Rights says that you're not allowed to put mandatory medical treatment on people, and the reason was because of what happened in Auschwitz. Now, am I comparing these people to Nazis? No, I'm not. But the fact is, that was what it was, and they wanted to violate it. The poverty that was created in this country was absolutely extraordinary as a result of the coronavirus, and that is something which we forget. We're talking now about the fact that there's a cost of living crisis. We're talking about the fact that the country is noticeably poorer. And we're talking about the fact that more people are attempting to come to the country as economic migrants, pretending to be asylum seekers. They are, of course, partly doing that because of the economic fallout from the coronavirus. And so, you know, we needed to take that into account. I think it was Lord Sumption, the former head of the UK Supreme Court, who said that his father-in-law had been killed by Whitty, Valence and Van Tam because he was somebody who had dementia. And because he was no longer able to see his daughter, he gave up and died. And of course, that will have been added to the number of excess deaths. I have a friend called Lee Aberton, who was in the parachute regiment, who was in the TSG, in the police, drank himself to death because he was placed under house arrest and wasn't able to do his personal training, which had kept him on the straight and narrow for years. That person was added to the excess deaths. But as anybody turned round to Whitty and said to him that Lee Aberton would be alive today, if it wasn't for the lockdown that he brought in. Now, I do worry slightly about the coronavirus hearings and the coronavirus inquiry, because it's, in order to go to the inquiry, you have to have a coronavirus test. What nutter is still doing that? So I do worry about them. But I do think there is one thing that's extremely important. We have to start calling to account the people that wrecked this country over coronavirus. Yes, okay, they were controlling the virus, but they gave up on everything. Remember what it said? It said, stay at home. What was it? Stay at home, protect the NHS. Protect the NHS. So hang on a second. I had to give up my freedom. I had to give up my job. I had to give up my wealth. I had to give up my family life. As a child, I would have to have given up my education in order to protect the NHS. It was a fundamental shift in the way that we are as a country. We used to be a country with a public health service. We are now a health service with a country attached in order to pay for it. And that is a fundamental change in mindset. We need to call these people to account. Fauci should be in jail. Whitty should be in jail. And we should say never, ever again. And we should do something about the vaccine programme. We need to now work with people like Andrew Bridgen, who can be a bit of a pain in the bum. But fundamentally, if we investigate all the claims of the stupidity of shutting the schools, all of the claims about the vaccines, all of the claims about the Wuhan virology lab, all of the claims about the damage to the economy, then actually we can rebuild credibility in our political and governmental system. If we are big enough and strong enough to admit that we lied about the vaccine, then eventually, we will rebuild confidence in the vaccine programme itself. Because one of the things I would make a point in closing is a lot of black and ethnic minority people, even those working in the NHS, were unwilling to get the vaccine because of the things that have been done to them in their own countries, or rather their families, in the past. The trust that was lost between the medical fraternity and the black African community in Africa has not been rebuilt in 100 years. When will we rebuild confidence in our healthcare system? Or is that going to be the end of the NHS? But I want to leave you with one final thing. Democracy is the real end to this story. The reality is, time and time again during coronavirus, the rights and the hobby horses of the scientists was put ahead of the democracy of this country. Parliament should have taken back control of the powers. What we had three people all the time making statements from Downing Street, not in front of Parliament, Whitty, Van Tam and Boris Johnson. No, 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 no. It was not for them to lock us up. It was not for them to close down our democracy. It was not for them to take away the education of our children. It was not for them to experiment on our people. It was for them to stand by and give us some advice on how we could go about our everyday business and make ourselves less likely to get this minor form of flu. And then what they should have done was they should have got the truth about what had happened in Wuhan, where they were experimenting on coronavirus variants. And it was said, and this is the bit that they won't tell you, it was said that there was no medical purpose in the experiments at Wuhan, and there was always a suspicion they were making a biological weapon. And now the allegation is they accidentally let it leak from the lab. And what we've got is Whitty, we've got Tedros, we've got Xi Jinping, and we've got Fauci talking about bats in a fish market. Absolutely despicable. And my final request to you is this. If there is ever another lockdown, please remember, it is your patriotic duty to ignore it. Do not let them do it again. Sometimes you have to stand up for your own rights, and placing an entire country under house arrest, entire continent under house arrest at the request of Xi Jinping of China is not acceptable. Please do donate to the Patriot Fund below. Until next time, goodbye.